Okay, let's talk about schizophrenia. The hallmark of schizophrenia is psychosis, defined as a departure from reality. Literally speaking, one's thoughts and behaviors do not match the reality of the physical environment. However, we also see in schizophrenia emotional symptoms, some motivational impairment, and some cognitive impairment. So what I want to talk about is some of these behavioral symptoms and also some of the neurobiological conditions. And then I want to finish up talking about what some of the risk factors are. Okay, so for starters, we divide the behavioral symptoms into two categories, positive symptoms and negative symptoms. And we define the positive symptoms as that which is above and beyond what one would see in a normal person without schizophrenia. And the negative symptoms are defined as behaviors less than what one would expect in a normal person without schizophrenia. So we can see here in this figure from your textbook some of the positive and negative symptoms. So some positive symptoms might be hallucinations or delusions or disorganized thought or speech. Negative symptoms might manifest as a lack of emotional expression, flat affect, inability to experience pleasure, impaired motivation. So just by way of defining the terms here, delusions are false beliefs about the world that are not consistent with reality and maintained even in the face of evidence to the contrary. Okay, delusions are defined in several categories of persecutory delusions, people believing that everyone's out to get them, grandiose delusions, people believing that they're the king of the universe, reference delusions, for example, people believing that everything is referring to them, that song on the radio is being played just for them, and thought insertion, the belief that people are reading their thoughts. People have entered their minds and are reading or controlling their thoughts. Hallucinations, by contrast, are defined as perceiving something that's actually not there. And hallucinations can occur in every sensory modality. We can hear things that are not there, see things that are not there, smell things that are not there, taste or even feel things that are just not there. And in schizophrenia, we often see disorganized speech or disorganized behavior. The disorganized speech can take the form of just a stream of consciousness, a random stream of consciousness, and disorganized behavior can be just behaviors of arm and leg movements that really just are inappropriate, do not match the actual environment. Negative symptoms can, as I mentioned, take the form of anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure, or amotivation, the loss of any kind of active motivation, flat affect, just an under expression of emotional state, and alogia, which has been defined as a poverty of speech, just very limited speech. Okay, so one question would be, is schizophrenia genetically inherited? And there is some evidence that people who are related to someone with schizophrenia have a higher probability of developing schizophrenia. But even among identical twins, there is still only a 50% chance of the other twin also having schizophrenia. So it's not entirely inherited, but there certainly seems to be a genetic component. And the current thinking is that perhaps there is an array of genes that is inherited that confers a potential, a vulnerability to developing schizophrenia. And you can see from this figure in the textbook that the closer the relative, the higher the probability of also developing schizophrenia. In fact, a particular mutated gene that we've labeled DISC1 is seen in many patients with schizophrenia, but not all. There is an association between people who have developed schizophrenia and having an older father. And the reasoning behind this finding, the theoretical interpretation, is that perhaps older men, the sperm of older men, have experienced more cell divisions over time and therefore more opportunity for potential mutations, and are impaired in that way and might confer some kind of inherited vulnerability to schizophrenia. So a couple more things here. The age of onset of schizophrenia is about your age right now, about late teens to early 20s, so transition to full adulthood. And we also know that schizophrenia is associated with prenatal stress, so the mother's stress during pregnancy, also maternal illness, mother's illness during pregnancy. There's also an association between prevalence of schizophrenia and city living. And there are a number of interpretations of this possible association, possibly due to the impact of some kind of additional pollutants in the environment of an inner city, or it could be that there's something about living in the city that attracts people with schizophrenia. So these associations are not necessarily cause and effect, and have to be careful in how we interpret those associations. Okay, so we also see some interesting neurobiological conditions in people with schizophrenia. One of those is enlarged ventricles in the brain, and one school of thought in interpreting this is the brain is a contained area, so if you're giving more space to something, then something else has to suffer, right? So it's possible that these enlarged ventricles come at the expense of thinner cortex. And so the cortex is where we do our higher reasoning and the integration of a lot of thought processes. So it would be consistent with the symptoms, the behavioral symptoms that we see in people with schizophrenia, a lack of ability to properly integrate a number of cognitive functions. And we do, in fact, see accelerated cortical thinking and thinning in people with schizophrenia. And interestingly, these same people with the enlarged ventricles also express this mutated DISC1 gene. So they seem to be associated with each other, these two conditions. And here you can see a couple of examples of the enlarged ventricles. You can see they show up in these neuroimaging as holes basically in the middle of the brain, and you can see they are enlarged, they're bigger in the two affected individuals in this graphic. And just another depiction here about the difference in size in the ventricles among people with schizophrenia. And in this graphic from the textbook, you can see the accelerated cortical thinning among those with schizophrenia. We also see less neural activity in the frontal cortex among people with schizophrenia. This is referred to as the hypofrontality hypothesis. And again, the frontal cortex, this is where a lot of the logical reasoning and the integration of a lot of thought processes would occur. So it's consistent with what we're seeing in behavioral symptoms. Pharmaceutical drugs that block dopamine receptors relieve some of the positive symptoms in people with schizophrenia. contrast that with some recreational drugs actually increase dopamine release and produce symptoms similar to schizophrenia, like the disordered thought. These two pieces of evidence have led to what we call the dopamine hypothesis, that schizophrenia is caused by an excess of dopamine release or expression of dopamine receptors. We also have a hypothesis surrounding the neurotransmitter glutamate, and the hypothesis is that schizophrenia is caused by an underactivation of glutamate receptors. And the evidence we have for that is drugs like PCP and ketamine actually block some glutamate receptors, and this produces some schizophrenic-like symptoms. So that would be consistent with that hypothesis. Here's a graphic from your textbook showing how a drug like PCP might be blocking the glutamate receptor. Now, you also have readings posted on Moodle with some annotations, so you can sort of sift through those. These readings pursue alternative hypotheses and additional evidence of other factors that are associated with schizophrenia and might give us more of a clue of how schizophrenia is occurring and then develops over time.